Well, it's good to be with you again today. We're looking at our fourth lesson of Chapter 3 today, so let's go ahead and get organized. For materials, you want to have Activity 3-4, and that is your little glossary you've been making, and today you're going to go ahead and complete that by filling in the section on vegetation. You can do that as much as possible during the lesson. And then you'll also need your Bible with you today. On our agenda, we're going to do a climate review to begin with. Then our main topic today is vegetation, and we'll be doing a brief Bible study as we talk about vegetation today. Our main idea: 3 basic types of biomes exist in today's world. They are forests, grasslands, and wastelands. For your goals today, you need to describe the vegetation in the 3 basic biomes, distinguish the 4 types of forests, and list examples of how biomes influence human civilization. Let's go ahead and get started by looking at our chapter verse together. So read this with me. Our verse this chapter is Genesis 8:22. While the earth remaineth, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. All right, and as mentioned in our organizer, we are going to start with a review of climate. So let's see what you remember about climate. You need to match the phrase to the appropriate climate. So I'll be reading the phrase, you pick out the appropriate climate. All right, permanently frozen ice. That's going to be your ice cap. Changes according to altitude. Varied highland. Rains year-round, and it doubles in the winter time. Rain year-round, double rain in the winter. That's our marine west coast, about 3 inches in the summer and about 6 inches during the winter seasons. Less than 10 inches of rain per year. That's desert climate. World's best farmland. We talked about a group, but we talked about a specific division as well as a category. Humid subtropical. Cold, but supports evergreens. That's going to be your taiga or subpolar. Wet winters and dry summers. Okay, you might have said savanna or Mediterranean. Savanna is the tropical wet and dry, and Mediterranean also has 2 seasons. Okay, then we have irregular rains due to distance from ocean. It's going to be your humid continental, further in on the continent. Large trees with rain all year. That's your rainforest, tropical wet. This climate supports grasses and grains. That's your steppe, prairie, or semi-arid. And lastly, cold but supports shrubs and grasses. That's our tundra or polar climate. All right, I hope that you did well on that. We're going to go ahead and be talking about vegetation today. In Genesis 1, verses 11 through 13, we read, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, an herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the third day. So after God created the earth and the atmosphere, he also created plants. And that's what we're discussing today. Vegetation. What is vegetation? It's simply plants. Plants in an area or region. And the biomes are related to the vegetation in an area, but they're not limited to just that. Remember that your goals stated that you needed to discern the biomes. Well, the biomes are actually, or a biome is actually a large region characterized by a particular group of plants and animals. So the vegetation and animals determine what type of biome a region is. Biomes also influence culture. They influence the economy, what type of jobs people have, whether they farm or not, what type of products they're able to produce, and that influences their trade. Are they primarily agricultural? Do they have other resources that are available to them? Biomes also influence the society of a culture, and that includes their daily life. What do they do every day? It includes their homes, their clothing, their pastimes. Other areas of influence would be government. For example, if people lived in a region that was very sparse vegetation and they were nomadic, they had to travel around to find grains for their animals to eat, then that would influence their government, what type of government they had. It would influence their arts and crafts, perhaps even their religion, the way they learn and think, the way they teach their children. So biomes do have a very great influence on culture. The three basic biomes that we're going to be learning about, remember a biome is just a region with a particular plant and animal life, are forests, grasslands, and wastelands. Forests, grasslands, and wastelands. And we're going to start with forests. You need to be able to list the 4 types of forests, and those are tropical rainforests, shrub forests, coniferous forests, and also deciduous forest. And we're going to start with the tropical rainforest. Now, actually, all forests can be broken down into tiers, similar to a canopy. You have your grasses and things, your mosses and lichens sometimes on the ground, and then you have your smaller plants, maybe some plants that don't get as much sunlight or don't need as much sunlight, and you have your taller trees, and you have your animals kind of in tiers, like rabbits along the ground, snakes and things, then squirrels that run up trees, birds that are up in the tops. So really we could divide any type, that was just kind of like a woodland forest I was thinking of, or a deciduous forest, but rainforests are especially known for their canopies. They have over 150 varieties of plants and many varieties of animals living in all different layers of the forest. And their canopies are like 100 feet above the ground. A lot of animals, monkeys and birds and different species live in the canopies. And the vegetation and wildlife actually differ according to the tier of the rainforest. Now, what kind of soil, when you think of rainforest, what kind of soil do you think a tropical rainforest has? Well, when I first thought of it, I thought, oh, it's probably really rich and it supports all this beautiful wildlife and all these unique varieties of plants. But really, the soil is very poor in a rainforest. The tropical rainforest, here's an example of one. You can see the beauty, the height of the trees, and even some of the color there in the plants. You would think, wow, that soil must be rich to support such beautiful vegetation. What happens is, as soon as any nutrients come to the soil, they are just sucked up by all that vegetation. They're just used right up, and the soil just cannot keep any nutrients, so it's very poor soil. And Some of the nutrition is actually leached away, and by leaching we mean it's just washed away. All the water that runs through the soil carries the nutrients away, and we'll be learning more about that in a later chapter. But the vegetation of the tropical rainforest areas actually helps to retain the moisture. So it's a real humid area, and it increases precipitation. That's why you have so much water coming through and leaching the nutrients from the ground. And what happens is people think, oh, this would be a great place. We're going to move in there. We're going to cut these trees down. We're going to farm. And when people move into the tropical rainforest, they literally burn and chop down a large area of the forest for their fields. And it is pretty good for lumber. But once the rainforest vegetation is clear, that soil is poor. It won't support other plants, the crops that are trying to be grown, and the rainforest vegetation can't revive because the little layer of nutrients that was there has now been destroyed. There's nothing to sustain new life for the rainforest to grow back. So it has been a concern that a lot of the rainforests have been destroyed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of our lesson. But keep in mind that rainforests are well known for their canopies. They do have poor soil. Many of them have been, or much of the area of rainforests have been destroyed. There's been a lot of destruction from mankind. And also, temperate or tropical rainforests. Did you know that there are rainforests in areas other than the tropics? That's right. We're talking about particularly tropical rainforests, but a rainforest is any forest located in a wet climate region. In fact, the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. and other temperate areas actually have rainforests, but they're not tropical rainforests, they're temperate rainforest. Okay, so it can be a rainforest, but it depends on where it's located. If it's in the tropics, it's a tropical rainforest. If it's in the temperate zones, above and below that, then it's a temperate rainforest. And of course, the vegetation and the wildlife would differ as well. Then we'll move on to shrub forests. Now, there's no general consensus about how to classify the shrub forest or Mediterranean vegetation. Just think of the Mediterranean climate that has the wet winters and the dry summers, so that fits into this shrub forest area. But in many places it looks just like a wasteland. There's a few scattered shrubs and a few plants around, but it's not necessarily very distinct. Shrub forests are also sometimes referred to as woodlands. Chaparral, which is wet. It has a wet and a dry season. It's dry in the summer. And temperate savanna. So these are all different terms that are sometimes used for shrub forests. And the temperate savanna actually has a wet and a dry season as well, but it's dry in the wintertime. So it's kind of opposite of the Mediterranean, the chaparral, wet and dry season. Okay, so those are some different areas that are referred to as shrub forests. And here's an example of a shrub forest. You don't really see any trees. It's not really a grassland. It's not really a desert. It doesn't really fit in to a lot of the categories. And that's why they say there's not a real consensus about what exactly is shrub forest. But chaparral and temperate savanna, woodlands, all those can sometimes be classified under shrub forests. Okay, that brings us to our coniferous forests, and this is one that you should have learned about before in science. You might have learned about these others as well. We're just kind of highlighting. We're not going to get into all the earth science details, but a coniferous forest, of course, consists of conifers, and these are trees that produce their seeds in a cone. And just think of cone, conifer, coniferous. That's where it all comes from. The trees generally have needles and they thrive in acid soils. Unlike other trees, these trees are able to thrive in that type of soil. Most of them are evergreens like pines, firs, and redwoods. Here's an example of a coniferous forest. And sometimes you'll even see this type of tree along with deciduous. The forests kind of have a progression, which we won't get into, but if you're interested in that, you might want to brush up on it or read in the earth science textbook more about that. The deciduous forest is one that's very common in the United States, and it consists, of course, of deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are those that lose their leaves sometime in the year. They have a particular growing season. It's between the killing frosts of spring, the last one of spring, and the killing frosts of fall, the first one of fall, that time in between there. So mainly your summertime is really when they're going to grow the most. Many of them are known as hardwoods. These are the oak, the maple, the elm, and people use those to make furniture and homes and objects like that. So they're very important. The coniferous trees are not as good. They're softer. They have more of the sap, and so if you try to burn them or something, they smoke, and they're not. Sometimes you'll see pine, like knotty pine, done for panels along a room or maybe cabinets, but it's not as common to use those types of wood in making furniture, you know, buildings and things like that. They're not as valuable, we could say it that way. Now here is an example of a deciduous forest. You can see they have the broadleaf, the flat leaves, and these are the ones that are going to change color and drop off sometime during the year and then regain their leaves later on. Examples are oak, maple, elm, those types of trees. Now we're going to use our vegetation map to help us keep track of where some of these vegetation areas occur in the world. And we have a few more that we want to cover, but let's go ahead and look. We're going to go exploring. Our first little box here has to do with forests. So we're going to stop at this time and look at these questions. All right, this is pages 52 and 53, but we're going to also need to compare to the climate map. So I have my climate map. Now, if you don't see the title, they look almost the same. So you have to be sure that you're looking at the correct maps. You'll want to look in your own book because I'm not going to be able to get close enough to this to really show you the detail, okay? But you'll want to turn to those pages. Our first question, compare the coniferous forest on this map to the climate map. In which climate are they most common? Okay, so we're looking for the coniferous forest. That is the blue forest. Notice it's the light blue all along the western U.S., up in Canada, and northern Asia. Let's look then to our climate map of the same area. It's mostly blue. It's a little different here, but in Asia, again, it's mostly the light blue color. You look at your key on your climate map, and we see that that is subpolar, or taiga. Remember, that's going to be the climate that does get warm enough to support trees. We mentioned earlier evergreens, and so that makes sense. It goes right along with our coniferous forest, and they even have them colored similarly, so that kind of helps us keep track. All right, here's another question concerning our forests. Compare the deciduous forest on our vegetation map, this map, to the climate map. In which climate are they most common? Okay, let's take a look at that. Our deciduous forests are a nice green color, so all along the eastern U.S., up into Canada a little bit in Brazil, the tip of South America here, a lot here in Europe, and Eastern Asia, as well as some in Australia. Let's compare. Start with the North America. We can see Eastern U.S., pretty similar. We have our humid continental, also a little bit of humid subtropical. Okay, what about Europe? Mediterranean, humid continental. Asia, we have the humid subtropical and humid continental. What do we have in the little areas here? We have the marine west coast, Australia. We have the subtropical and marine west coast. So what would we say? In which climates are they common? Mostly they're in the humid continental and humid subtropical climates. That's where most of those deciduous forests are. And those are very important because that's where most people want to settle. There's land there when the colonial people came over, they needed these trees to chop them down, build themselves forts and houses and buildings and so on. So that's where people are going to first settle. A lot of the areas where we see forests on this vegetation map, there are really no longer forests there. You can look right here and you know that there are many cities in this area, but this is what would have been there originally, the deciduous forests. Okay, now let's compare the rainforests on this map with the rainy wet climate on the climate map and see if we can explain the differences that occur. Take a moment to think about that one. If you need to, you can pause the program. Yeah, that one's maybe a little tough. Okay, let's look. Our rainforest is the salmon color. Brazil, a little Brazil, a lot of Brazil, South America, a lot of the northern countries there, Latin America, a little bit in Africa, and the Pacific Islands. Again, we see it pretty much along the equator, and it's pretty similar. Let's look at the rainforest on our climate map. We see it's pretty similar, isn't it? The Pacific Islands, Africa, and the little tip there in Africa, Brazil and the northern part of South America, Latin America. There are some differences, however. Let's look at the vegetation map. Try to kind of keep your climate map there too, and you can flip back and forth a little bit if you need to. But the main differences involve 5 areas that have rainforests, but they don't actually have the tropical wet climate. Pretty interesting, huh? Let's look at the areas, see if we can find them. Okay, first of all, the Nile Basin, see right here, it actually has the rainforest, but when we look on our climate map, we don't have the tropical wet climate. So that's one place where there's a difference. What do you think is going to cause the difference? There's a Nile River here. That might be helpful, right? Okay, Ethiopian highlands. Let's look on that. In Africa, that's going to be right here. Here's Ethiopia. And again, we look in Ethiopia and we see, you can see the highlands, varied highland, but we don't have the tropical wet climate. It's going to have to do with the mountains there, isn't it? They probably get some of that orographic precipitation perhaps in those mountains, coming up over those mountains from the ocean. Another area is the west coast of Madagascar. See this little island? East coast and west coast have tropical rainforests, but on our climate map, only the east coast has the tropical wet climate. All right, and that might have to do with the fact that Madagascar is an island. I'm just giving you some suggestions here. I didn't research every single one of these, but northeast India, right in here, we have our rainforests. I'll just flip over, but we don't have that climate here. We have the humid subtropical climate. And then we have North Australia with some rainforests, but again, we don't have that climate. Just a tiny smidge of the rainforest climate, the tropical wet climate there. Now, what do you think causes these differences? I gave you a few hints, just little suggestions, generalities. The difference is actually caused by local variations in soil. So that was one I didn't mention. Soil, mountains came up, and rivers, which also came up. So we have to keep in mind, we are learning generalities. Each area is going to be a little unique because of the variation with which God created the earth. So we'll have to keep that in mind as we study through the different countries. Now, much of the land in the tropics and temperate zones is actually too dry to support forests and trees, but it can support grasses. And that brings us to our next division, which is grasslands. Okay, and there are 2 types of grasslands, tropical or savannas, and temperate or steppe areas. Here's an example of a typical grassland. You can see all of the grasses, the grains that are growing there. But you don't notice any trees, do you? Now, it is true that some trees do grow in grasslands. Think of our savanna. When we talked about climate previously, I think we had a giraffe there, my favorite, and there was a little tree in the background. So there are some trees. But almost always, if there is a tree in the grasslands, the tree is going beside a stream or a river, because there the roots can go down deep and get a constant water supply. And this reminds us of some passages from the Bible. I want you to take a moment to read Psalm 1:3 and Jeremiah 17:5-8. Find out, what comparisons do they make to vegetation? All right, now I don't have time to read with you, but hopefully you read those and found the comparisons. Jeremiah compares a man who does not place his trust in God to a barren desert, while a man who does trust in God is like a thriving tree beside a constant water source. And that's the same thing we see in the Psalms. Those that he that meditates on the law of the Lord is like a tree planted by the river. And that's the comparison that's made in Scripture. So we see that the writers of Scripture knew their geography, didn't they? They knew about their climates and vegetation. They knew that big, strong, strapping trees don't grow in barren areas. And those barren areas are often referred to as wastelands. Deserts can be wastelands. Tundra, highland, and ice cap can all be referred to as wastelands. Here's an example of a desert. We can see here there is some vegetation in the desert. Normally, cacti can grow. They have a very fleshy type of leaf that holds in the water for them. The only other type of shrubs that you find in the desert are ones that sprout up really quick and then die really quickly because they can't live long there. The tundra has little vegetation due to the permafrost of the ground, but they have mosses, lichens, grasses, and so on. The highlands have a great variety, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. And the ice cap, of course, has no vegetation because nothing can grow there. I'm going to talk briefly, though, about the highlands. What types of vegetation do you think you'll find in the highlands? This diagram on page 55 shows us we can find almost every type because of the rain shadow effect and also because of the increase in altitude, the lapse rate. Now we want to wrap up by discussing man's place. The biomes were created by God with variety to supply necessities for man, but they have been altered by the flood and also by man, carrying different plants back and forth, diseases, weeds, and so on. And a lot of them have become homogenized or uniform. A lot of concerns were voiced in 1992 at an Earth Summit of 153 countries. They made treaties about biodiversity to limit the loss of habitats and species. The U.S. didn't sign that one. And pollution, which the U.S. did sign. A big theme was sustainable development, which means meeting the present needs but saving enough for future generations. And a lot of people oppose the treaties, not because of the goals, but just because they want each nation to solve its own problems instead of international regulations. But we want to keep in mind that God wants us to subdue the earth, but also take care of it. We're going to focus more on that in our next two chapters. Now let's quickly look at your assignment. Read pages 51 to 56. Do the chapter review on page 57. As you read, think about this question. To what other areas of life can you apply the principle of sustainable development? And where in the world do they speak Magyar? That is in the country of Hungary. For next time, see if you can find this. Where can you find the world's only freshwater sharks?